Section 21 of Mind Amongst the Spindles, edited by Charles Knight. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. The Village Chronicle. Chapter 1. "Come, Lena dear," said Mr. Wheeler to his little daughter. "Lay by your knitting, if you please, and read me the paper." "What, Pa? This old paper? The Village Chronicle?" "Old, Lena? Why, it is damp from the press. Not so old, by more than a dozen years, as you are." "But, Pa, the news is olds. Our village mysteries are all worn threadbare by the gossiping old maids before the printer can get them in type, and the foreign information is more quickly obtained from other sources. And, Pa, I wish you wouldn't call me Lena. It sounds so childish, and I begin to think myself quite a young lady, almost in my teens, you know, and Angeline is not so very long." "Well, Angeline, as you please, but see if there's not something in the paper." "Oh, yes, Pa. To please you, I will read the stupid new, I mean, concern. Well, in the first place, we have some poetry. Some of our village poets. Genius, you know, admits not of distinctions of sex. Effusions, or rather confusions. Miss Helena, it used to be Ellen once, carols, sublime sentiments upon the Belvedere Apollo, which she never saw, nor anything like it, and knows nothing about. She had better write about our penny post, and then we might feel an interest in her lucubrations, even if not very intrinsically valuable. But if she does not want to be an old maid, she might as well leave off writing sentimental poetry for the newspapers, for who will marry a blue?" "There is much that I might say in reply, but I will wait until you are older. And now do not let me hear you say anything more about old maids, at least deridingly, for I have strong hopes that my little girl will be one herself." "No, Pa, never. I will not marry, at least while you, or Alfred, or Jimmy are alive, but I cannot be an old maid, not one of those tattling, envious, starched-up, prudish creatures, whom I have always designated as old maids, whether they are married or single, on the sunny or shady side of 30. "Well, child, I hope you will never be metamorphosed into an old maid, then. But now for the Chronicle. I will excuse you from the poetry, if you will read what comes next." "Thank you, my dear father, 1,000 times. You would have made me as sick as a cupful of warm water would do. You know I had rather take so much hot drops. But the next article is Miss Simpkins's very original tale, entitled 'The Injured One,' probably all about love and despair, and ladies so fair, and men who don't care, if the mask they can wear, and the girls must beware. Now ain't I literary? But to be a heroine also, I will muster my resolution, and commence the story. Madeline and Amarilla were the only daughters of Mr. Beaufort, of H., New Hampshire. Now, Pa, I can't go any further. I would as lieve travel through the deserts of Sahara, or run the gauntlet among the Seminoles, as to wade through this sloshy story. Miss Simpkins always has such names for her heroines, and they would do very well if they were placed anywhere but in the unromantic towns of our granite state. H, I suppose, stands for Hawk, or Hopkinton. Miss Simpkins is so soft that I do not believe Mr. Baxter would publish her stories, if he were not engaged to her sister. She makes me think of old, deaf Uncle Jeff, in the story, who wanted somebody to love." "And she does love. She loves everybody. And I am sorry to hear you talk so of this amiable and intellectual girl. But I do not wish to hear you read her story now. As for her names, she would not find one unappropriated by our town folks. What comes next?" "The editorial, Pa, and the caption is, 'Our Representatives.' I had 10 times rather read about the antediluvians, and I wish sometimes they might go and keep them company. And now for the items. Our new bell got cracked in its winding way to this 'ere town, and the meeting house at the West Parish has been fired by an incendiary, and the old elm near the central house has been blown down, and Widow Fry has had a yoke of oxen struck by lightning, and old Colonel Morton fell down dead in a fit of apoplexy, and the bridge over the branch needs repairing, and a friend of good order wishes that our young men would not stand gaping around the meeting house doors before or after service. and a friend of equal rights wishes that people might sell and drink as much rum as they please, without interference, etc., etc. And all these things we knew before, as well as we did our ABCs. Next are the cards. The ladies have voted their thanks to Mr. K. for his lecture upon phrenology, the matrimonial part, I presume, included. And the Anti-Slavery Society is to have a fair, at which will be sold all sorts of abolition things, such as anti-slavery paper, wafers, and all such imported articles. I declare I will make a nigger doll for it. And Mr. P. of Boston is to deliver a lecture upon temperance, and the trustees of the Academy have chosen Mr. Dalton for the preceptor, and here's his long advertisement. And the overseers of the poor are ready to receive proposals for a new almshouse, and all these things, Pa, which have been the talk of the town this long time. But here's something new. Our minister, dear Mr. Olden, has been very seriously injured by an accident upon the Boston and Salem Railroad. The news must be very recent, for we have not heard of it, and it is crowded into very fine type. Oh, how sorry I am for him! Well, Lena, or Miss Angeline, there is something of sufficient importance to repay you for the trouble of reading it, and I am very glad that you have done so, for I will start upon my intended journey to Boston to-day, and can assist him to return home. Anything else? Oh, yes, Pa, a long list of those who have taken advantage of the Bankrupt Act, and the deaths and marriages, but all mentioned here, with whose names we were familiar, have been subjects of table talk these several days. Well, is there no foreign news? Yes, Pa. Queen Victoria has given another ball at Buckingham Palace, and Prince Albert has accepted a very fine bloodhound from Major Sharp of Houston, and Sir Howard Douglas has been made Civil Grand Cross of the Bath, etc., etc. Are not these fine things to fill up our Republican papers with? Well, my daughter, look at the doings in Congress. That will suit you. You know better, Pa. They do nothing there but scold and strike and grumble, then pocket their money and go home. See, here it begins. The proceedings of the House can hardly be said to have been important. An instructive and delightful scene took place between Mr. Wise of Virginia and Mr. Stanley of South Carolina. Yes, Pa, that's the way they spend their time. In this act of the farce, or tragedy, one called t'other a bulldog, t'other called one a coward. Do you wish to hear any more? You are somewhat out of humor, my child. But are there no new notices? Yes, here is an assessor's notice, and an assignee's notice, and a contractor's notice, but you do not care anything about them. And here's an auction notice. What auction? Read it, my love. Why, the late old Mr. Gardner's farmhouse and all his furniture are to be sold at auction. And here is a notice of a meeting of the directors of the Pentucket Bank, to be held this very afternoon. I am very glad to have learned of it, for I must be there. Is that all? All? No, indeed. Here are some long articles, full of whereases and resolves, and be it enacteds, but I know you will excuse me from reading them. And now for the advertisements. Here's a fine new lot of chindelaines, just received at Grosvenor's. Oh, Pa, do let me have a new dress, won't you? No, I can't. At least, I do not see how I can. But if you will promise to read my paper through patiently for the future, and will prepare my valise for my journey to Boston, I will see what I may do. Meantime I must be off to the directors' meeting. And now let me remind you that 2 items, at least, in this paper, have been of much importance to me, and one, it seems, somewhat interesting to you. So no more fretting about the Chronicle, if you want a new gown. Mr. Wheeler left the room, and Angeline seated herself at the work-table to repair his vest. She was sorry she had fretted so much about the Chronicle, but she did wish her father would take the Ladies' Companion or something else in its stead. While seated there, her little brother came running into the room, all out of breath, and but just able to gasp out, "Oh, Lena, there's a man at the Central House who has stopped in the stage, and he's going right on to Kentucky, and straight through to the town where Alfred lives, for I heard him say so, and I asked him if he would carry anything for us, and he said, yes, willingly. So I ran home as fast as I could come, to tell you to write a note, do up a paper or something, because he will be so sure to get it, And right from us, too, as fast as it can go. Now do be quick, or the stage will start off." "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Angeline. "How I do wish we had a New York Mirror, or a Philadelphia Courier, or a Boston Gazette, or anything but this stupid Chronicle. Do look, Jimmy, is there nothing in this pile of papers?" "No, nothing that will do, so fold up the Chronicle, quick, for the stage is starting." Angeline, who had spent some moments in looking for another paper, now had barely time to scrawl the short word "Lena" on the paper, wrap it in an envelope, and direct it. Jimmy snatched it as soon as it was ready, and ran out "fill tilt" in knightly phrase, or as he afterwards said, lickety-split. The stage was coming on at full speed, and he wished to stop it. Many a time he had stood by the roadside with his school companions, and waving his cap, and stretching out his neck, had hallooed, "Hurrah for Jackson!" and he feared that, like the boy in the fable, who called "Wolves, wolves," if he now shouted to them from the roadside they would not heed him. So he ran into the middle of the road, threw up his arms, and stood still. The driver barely reined in his horses within a few feet of the daring boy. "Where's the man who is going straight ahead to Kentucky?" "Here, my lad," replied a voice, as a head popped out of the window to see what was the matter. "Well, here's the paper which I wish you to carry to my brother, and if you stop long enough where he is, you must go and see him, and tell him you saw me too." "Well done, my lad. You are a keen one. I'll do your bidding, but don't you never run under stage horses again." He took the packet, while the driver cracked his whip, and the horses started as the little boy leaped upon the bank, shouting, "Hurrah for Yankee Land and old Kentucky!" Chapter 2. In a rude log hut of western Kentucky was seated an animated and intelligent-looking young man. A bright moon was silvering the forest tops, which were almost the only prospect from his window. But in that beauteous light the rough clearing around seemed changed to fairyland, and even his rude domicile partook of the transient renovation. His lone walls, his creviced roof, and ragged floor, were transformed beneath its silvery veil, and truly did it look as though it might well be the abode of peaceful happiness. "I feel as though I could write poetry now," said Alfred to himself. "Let me see. The spirits call to the absent, or something like that. But if I should strike my light, and really get pens, ink, and paper, it would all evaporate, vanish, abscond, make tracks, become sacred, be OPH. Ah, yes, the poetry would go, but the feeling, the deep affection, which would find some other language than simple prose, can never depart. How I wish I could see them all. There's not a codger in my native town, not a crusty, fusty old bachelor, not an envious, tattling old maid, not a flirt, sot, pauper, idiot, or sainted hypocrite, but I could welcome with an embrace. If I could only see my father, or Jimmy, or Lena, dear girl, how much better I should feel. It would make me 10 years younger to have a chat with Lena, and, to tell the truth, I should like to see any woman, just to see how it would seem. I'd go 1/4 of a mile, now, to look at a row of aprons hung out to dry. But there, it's no use to talk. An evening like this is such as one might entice me to my mother's grave, were I at home. Oh, if she were but alive! If I could only know that she was still somewhere on the wide earth, to think and pray for me, I might be better, as well as happier. Methinks it must be a blessed thing to be a mother, if all sons cherish that parent's memory as I have mine. And they do. It cheers and sustains the exile in a stranger's land. It invigorates him in trial, and lights him through adversity. It warns the felon, and haunts and harrows the convict. It strengthens the captive, and exhilarates the homeward bound. Truly it must be a blessed thing to be a mother. He stopped, for in the moonlight was distinctly seen the figure of a horseman, emerging from the public road, and galloping across the clearing. He turned toward the office of the young surveyor, and in a few moments the carrier had related the incident by which he obtained the paper, and placed the village Chronicle in Alfred's hand. He struck a light, tore off the wrapper, and the only written word which met his eye was Lena. "Dear name," said he, "I could almost kiss it, especially as there is none to see me. She must have been in a prodigious hurry, and how funny that little rascal Jimmy must have looked. Well, when he next doth run a race, may I be there to see." He took the paper to read. It was a very late one. He had never before received one so near the date, and even that line of dates was now so pleasing. First was Miss Helena Carroll's poetry. "Dear girl," said he, "what a beautiful writer she is! Really, this is poetry. This is something which carries us away from ourselves, and more closely connects us with the enduring, high, and beautiful. Methinks I see her now, more thin, pale, and ethereal in her appearance than when we were gay schoolmates. But I wonder that, with all her treasures of heart and intellect, she is still Helena Carroll." And now here's Miss Simpkin's story of "The Injured One." Beautiful, interesting, and instructive, I am confident, and I will read it, every word. But she italicizes too much. She throws too lavishly the bright robes of her prolific fancy upon the forms she conjures up from New England hills and vales. I wonder if she remembers now the time when she made me shake the old apple tree, near the pound, for her, and in jumping down I nearly broke my leg. Well, if I read her story, I will try that it does not break my heart. And here's an excellent editorial about "Our Representatives." I will read it again. And now for the items. These were all highly interesting to the absentee, and on each did he expatiate to himself. How different were his feelings from his sister's, as he read of the cracked bell, the burned meeting-house, the dead oxen, the apoplectic old colonel, the decaying bridge, the hints of the friends of good order and equal rights. Then there was a little scene suggested by every card. He wondered who had their heads examined at the phrenological lecture, and if the West Parish old farmers were now as stiffly opposed to the science. And he would like to see Lena's chart, and know if Jimmy had brains. He was sure he had legs and a big heart for a little boy. And he wondered what girls ran up to have their heads felt in public, and what the man said about matrimony, an affair which in old times was thought to have more to do with the heart than the head. Then his imagination went forward to the fair of the Anti-Slavery Society, and he wondered where it would be, and who would go, and what Lena would make, and whether so much fuss about slavery was right or wrong, and if "father" approved of it. Then the temperance lecture was the theme for another self-disquisition. He wondered who had joined the society, and how the Washingtonians held out, and if Mr. Hawks was ever coming to the West. Then he was glad the trustees were determined to resuscitate the old academy. What grand times he had enjoyed there, especially at the exhibitions, and he wondered where all the pretty girls were who used to go to school with his bachelorship. Then they were to have a new almshouse, and 40 more things were mentioned of equal interest, not forgetting Mr. Olden's accident, for which "father would be so sorry." Then there were the marriages and deaths, each a subject of deep interest, as was the list of bankrupts. The foreign news was news to him, and Congress matters were not passed unheeded by. Then he read with deep interest every assessor's notice, also those of assignees, contractors, and auctioneers. There was not a single whereas or resolved but was most carefully perused, and every "be it enacted" stared him in the face like an old familiar friend. Then there were the advertisements, and Grosvenor's first attracted his attention from its big letters. "Shinda Lanes," said he. "What in the name of common sense are they? Something for gals' gowns, I guess. And what will they next invent for a name?" But each advertisement told its little history. Some of the old "pillars" of the town were still in their accustomed places, the same signatures, places, and almost the same goods, nothing much changed but the dates. Another advertisement informed him of the dissolution of an old co-partnership, and another showed the formation of a new one. Some old acquaintances had changed their location or business, and others were about to retire from it. Those whom he remembered as almost boys were now just entering into active life, and those who should now be preparing for another world were still laying up treasures on earth. One, who had been a farmer, was now advertising himself as a doctor. A lawyer had changed to a miller, and old Captain Prouty was postmaster. The former cobbler now kept the bookstore, and the young major had turned printer. The old printer was endeavoring to collect his debts for he said his devil had gone to Oregon, and he wished to go to the devil. Not a single puff did Alfred omit. He noticed every new book, swallowed every new nostrum. Old rags, buffalo oil, bear's grease, corn plaster, lip salve, accordions, feather renovations, silk dye houses, worm lozenges, ready-made clothing, ladies' slips, misses' ties, Christmas presents, sugar-house molasses, choice butter, shell combs, new music, healing lotions, last chance, hats and caps, prime cost, family pills, ladies' cuff pins, summer boots, vegetable conserve, muffs and boas, peas horehound candy, white ash coal, Bullyer's oil soup, universal panacea, tailoress wanted, unrivaled excelsior, excellent vanilla, tailor's spool cotton, rooms to let, chairs and tables, pleasant house, particular notice, family groceries, a removal, antidyspeptic bitters, etc., and etc., down to 1 cent reward, ran away from the subscriber, etc. Yes, he had read them all, and all with much interest, but one with a deeper feeling than was awakened by the others. It was the notice of the sale of the late Mr. Gardner's house, farm, etc. "And so," said Alfred, "Cynthia Gardner is now free. She used to love me dearly, at least she said so in everything but words, but the old man said she should never marry a harum-scarum scapegrace like me. Well, it's no great matter if I did sow all my wild oats then, for there is too little cleared land to do much at here. The old gentleman is dead, and I'll forgive him, but I will write this very night to Cynthia, and ask her to come and with me share whatever my hut bestows, my cornstalk bed, my frugal fare, my labor and repose." Lucinda. Ambition and Contentment. It has been said that all virtues, carried to their extremes, become vices, as firmness may be carried to obstinacy, gentleness to weakness, faith to superstition, etc., etc., and that while cultivating them, a perpetual care is necessary that they may not be resolved into all these kindred vices. But there are other qualities of so opposite a character that, though we may acknowledge them both to be virtues, we can hardly cherish them at the same time. Contentment is a virtue often urged upon us, and too often neglected. It is essential to our happiness, for how can we experience pleasure while dissatisfied with the station which has been allotted us, or the circumstances which befall us? But when contentment degenerates into that slothful feeling which will not exert itself for a greater good, which would sit and smile at ease upon the gifts which Providence has forced upon its possessor, and turns away from the objects which call for the active spring and tenacious grasp, when, I repeat, contentment is but another excuse for indolence, then it has ceased to be a virtue. And ambition, which is so often denounced as a vice, which is a vice when carried to an extent that would lead its votary to grasp all upon which it can lay its merciless clutch, and which heeds not the rights or possessions of a fellow being when conflicting with its own domineering will, which then becomes so foul a vice, this same ambition, when kept within its proper bounds, is then a virtue, and not only a virtue, but the parent of virtues, the spirit of laudable enterprise, the noble desire for superior excellence, the just emulation which would raise itself to an equality with the highest, all this is the fruit of ambition. Here then are two virtues, ambition and contentment, both to be commended, both to be cherished, yet at first glance at variance with each other, at all events, with difficulty kept within those proper bounds which will prevent a conflict between them. We are not metaphysicians, and did we possess the power to draw those finely penciled mental and moral distinctions, in which the acute reasoner delights so often to display his power, this would be no place for us to indulge our love for nicely attenuated theories. We are aware that to cherish ambition for the good it may lead us to acquire, for the noble impulses of which it may be the fountain spring, and yet to restrain those waters when they would gush forth with a tide which would bear away all better feelings of the heart, this, we know, is not only difficult, but almost impossible. to strive for a position upon some loftier eminence, and yet remain unruffled if those strivings are in vain, to remain calm and cheerful within the little circle where Providence has stationed us, yet actively endeavoring to enlarge that circle, if not to obtain admittance to a higher one, to plume the pinions of the soul for an upward flight, yet calmly sink again to the earth if these efforts are but useless flutterings, all this seems contradictory, though essential to perfection of character. Thankfulness for what we have, yet longings for a greater boon, resignation to a humble lot, and a determination that it shall not always be humble, ambition and contentment, how wide the difference, and how difficult for one breast to harbor them both at the same time. Nothing so forcibly convinces us of the frailty of humanity as the tendency of all that is good and beautiful to corruption. As in the natural world, earth's loveliest things are those which yield the most easily to blighting and decay, so in the spiritual, the noblest feelings and powers are closely linked to some dark passion. How easily does ambition become rapacity! And if the heart's yearnings for the unattainable are forcibly stilled, and the mind is governed by the determination that no wish shall be indulged but for that already in its power, how soon and easily may it sink into the torpor of inaction! To keep all the faculties in healthful exercise, yet always to restrain the feverish glow, must require a constant and vigilant self-command. How soon, in that long past sacred time when the Saviour dwelt on earth, did the zeal of one woman in her Master's cause become tainted with the earth-born wish that her sons might be placed, one on his right and the other upon his left hand, when he should sit upon his throne of glory. And how soon was there ardent love, mingled with the fiery zeal which would call down fire from heaven upon the heads of their fellow men! Here was ambition, but not a justifiable desire for elevation, an ambition, also, which had its source in some of the noblest feelings of the soul, and which, when directed by the pure principles which afterwards guided their conduct, was the heart-spring of deeds which shall claim the admiration, and spur to emulous exertions, the men of all coming time. Be content with what ye have, but never with what ye are, for the wish to be perfect, even as our Father in heaven is perfect, must ever be mingled with regrets for the follies and frailties which our weak nature seems to have entailed upon us. And while we endeavor to be submissive, cheerful, and contented with the lot marked out for us, may gratitude arouse us to the noble desire to render ourselves worthy of a nobler station than earth can ever present us, even to a place upon our Saviour's right hand in his heavenly kingdom. H. F. End of section 21. Section 22 of Mind Amongst the Spindles, edited by Charles Knight. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. A conversation on physiology. Introduction. Physiology, astronomy, geology, botany, and kindred sciences are not now, as formerly, confined to our higher seminaries of learning. They are being introduced into the common schools, not only of our large towns and cities, but of our little villages throughout New England. Hence, a knowledge of these sciences is becoming general. It needs not Sibylline wisdom to predict that the time is not far distant, when it will be more disadvantageous and more humiliating to be ignorant of their principles and technicalities, than to be unable to tell the length and breadth of Sahara, the rise, course, and fall of little rivers in other countries, which we shall never see, never hear mentioned, and the latitude and longitude of remote or obscure cities and towns. If a friend would describe a flower, she would not tell us that it has so many flower leaves, so many of those shortest things that rise from the center of the flower, and so many of the longest ones, but she will express herself with more elegance and rapidity by using the technical names of these parts, petals, stamens, and pistils. She will not tell us that the green leaves are formed some like a rose leaf, only that they are rounder, or more pointed, as the case may be, or if she can find no similitudes, She will not use 50 words in conveying an idea that might be given in one little word. We would be able to understand her philosophical description. And scientific lectures, the sermons of our best preachers, and the conversation of the intelligent presuppose some degree of knowledge of the most important sciences, and to those who have not this knowledge, half their zeal is lost. If we are so situated that we cannot attend school, we have, by far the greater part of us, hours for reading, and means to purchase books. We should be systematic in our expenditures. They should be regulated by the nature of the circumstances in which we find ourselves placed, by our wages, states of health, and situation of our families. After a careful consideration of these, and other incidentals that may be, we can make a periodical appropriation of any sum we please for the purchase of books. Our readings, likewise, should be systematic. If we take physiology, physiology should be read exclusively of all others, except our Bibles and a few well-chosen periodicals, until we acquire a knowledge of its most essential parts. Then let this be superseded by others, interrupted in their course only by occasional reviews of those already studied. But there are those whose every farthing is needed to supply themselves with necessary clothing, their unfortunate parents or orphan brothers and sisters with a subsistence. And forever sacred be these duties. Blessings be on the head of those who faithfully discharge them by a cheerful sacrifice of selfish gratification. Cheerful, did I say? Ah, many will bear witness to the pangs which such a sacrifice costs them. It is a hard lot to be doomed to live on in ignorance when one longs for knowledge, as the hart panteth after the water brook. My poor friend L's complaint will meet with an answering thrill of sympathy in many a heart. "Oh, why is it so?" said she, while tears ran down her cheeks. "Why have I such a thirst for knowledge, and not one source of gratification?" We may not know why, my sister, but faith bids us trust in God, and rest in his decree, to be content when he refuses more. Yet a spirit of true contentment induces no indolent yieldings to adverse circumstances, no slumbering and folding the hands in sleep, when there is so much within the reach of every one, worthy of our strongest and most persevering efforts. Mrs. Hale says, "There is a charm in knowledge, best when bought by vigorous toil of frame and earnest search of thought." And we will toil. Morning, noon, and evening shall witness our exertions to prepare for happiness and usefulness here, and for the exalted destiny that awaits us hereafter. But proper attention should be paid to physical comfort as well as to mental improvement. It is only by retaining the former that we can command the latter. The mind cannot be vigorous while the body is weak. Hence we should not allow our toils to enter upon those hours which belong to repose. We should not allow ourselves, however strong the temptation, to visit the lecture room, etc., if the state of the weather or of our health renders the experiment hazardous. Above all, we should not forget our dependence on a higher power. Paul may plant and Apollos water, but God alone giveth the increase. Anne. Isabel, before we commence our big talk, let me ask you to proceed upon the inference that we are totally ignorant of the subject under discussion. Eleonora. Yes, Isabel, proceed upon the fact that I am ignorant even of the meaning of the term physiology. Isabel. It comes from the Greek words physis, nature, and logia, a collection, or logos, discourse, and means a collection of facts or discourse relating to nature. Physiology is derived, first, into vegetable and animal, and the latter is subdivided into comparative and human. We shall confine our attention to human physiology, which treats of the organs of the human body, their mutual dependence and relation, their functions, and the laws by which our physical constitution is governed. A. And are you so heretical, dear Isabel, as to class this science, on the score of utility, with arithmetic and geography, the alpha and omega of common school education? I. Yes, It is important, inasmuch as it is necessary that we know how to preserve the fearfully delicate fabric which our Creator has entrusted to our keeping. We gather many wholesome rules and cautions from maternal lips. We learn many more from experiencing the painful results that follow their violation. But this kind of knowledge comes tardily. It may be when an infringement of some organic law, of which we were left in ignorance, has fastened upon us painful, perhaps fatal, disease. A. We may not always avoid sickness and premature death by a knowledge and observance of these laws, for there are hereditary diseases, in whose origin we are not implicated, and whose effects we cannot eradicate from our system by all knowledge, all device. I. But a knowledge of physiology is none the less important in this case. If the cords of our existence are shattered, they must be touched only by the skillful hand, or they break. E. Were it not for this, were there no considerations of utility in the plea, there are others sufficiently important to become impulsive. It would be pleasant to be able to trace the phenomena which we are constantly observing within ourselves to their right causes. I. Yes, we love to understand the springs of disease, even though a discovery of the cause neither suspends the effect nor heals it. We rejoice in health, and we love to know why it sits so strongly within us. The warm blood courses its way through our veins. The breath comes and goes freely in and out. The nerves, those subtle organs, perform their important offices. The hand, foot, brain, nay, the whole body, moves as we will. We taste, see, hear, smell, feel, and the inquiring mind delights in knowing by what means these wonderful processes are carried on, how far they are mechanical, how far chemical, how far resolvable into the laws of vitality. This we may learn by a study of physiology, at least as far as is known. We may not satisfy ourselves upon all points. There may be, when we have finished our investigations, a longing for a more perfect knowledge of ourselves, for some points must be greatly dark, so long as mind is fettered in its ragings and retarded in its investigations by its connection with the body. And this is well. We love to think of the immortal state as one in which longings for moral and intellectual improvement will all be satisfied. A. Yes, it would lose half its attractions if we might attain perfection here. E. And now permit me to bring you at once to our subject. What is this life that I feel within me? Does physiology tell us? It ought. I. It does not, however, indeed, it cannot. It merely develops its principles. E. The principles of life, what are they? I. The most important are contractibility and sensibility. E. Let me advertise you that I am particularly hostile to technical words, all because I do not understand them, I allow, but please humor this ignorance by avoiding them. I. And thus perpetuate your ignorance, my dear Eleonora? No, this will not do, for my chief object in these conversations is that you may be prepared to profit by lectures, essays, and conversations hereafter. You will often be thrown into the company of those who express themselves in the easiest and most proper manner, that is, by the use of technical words and phrases. These will embarrass you, and prevent that improvement which would be derived if these terms were understood. Interrupt me as often as you please with questions, and if we spend the remainder of the evening in compiling a physiological glossary, we may all reap advantage from the exercise. To return to the vital principles. Vital is from vita, life, contractibility, and sensibility. The former is the property of the muscles. The muscles, you know, are what we call flesh. They are composed of fibers which terminate in tendons. Alice, please give form to my ideas of the tendons. I. With the muscles, they constitute the agents of all motion in us. Place your hand on the inside of your arm, and then bend your elbow. You perceive that cord, do you not? That is a tendon. You have observed them in animals, doubtless. Anne. I have. They are round, white, and lustrous, and these are the muscular terminations. I. Yes, This tendon which you perceive is the termination of the muscles of the forearm, and it is inserted in the lower arm to assist in its elevation. E. Now we are coming to it. Please tell me how I move a finger, how I raise my hand in this manner. I. It is to the contractile power of the muscles that you are indebted for this power. I will read what Dr. Paley says of muscular contraction. It will make it clearer than any explanation of mine. He says, a muscle acts only by contraction. Its force is exerted in no other way. When the exertion ceases, it relaxes itself, that is, it returns by relaxation to its former state, but without energy. E. Just as this India rubber springs back after extension, for illustration. I. Very well, Eleonora. He adds, this is the nature of the muscle fiber, and being so, it is evident that the reciprocal energetic motion of the limbs, by which we mean with force in opposite directions, can only be produced by the instrumentality of opposite or antagonist muscles, of flexors and extensors answering to each other. For instance, the biceps and brachius internus muscles, placed in the front part of the upper arm, by their contraction bend the elbow, and with such a degree of force as the case requires, or the strength admits. The relaxation of these muscles after the effort would merely let the forearm drop down. For the back stroke, therefore, and that the arm may not only bend at the elbow, but also extend and straighten itself with force, other muscles, the longus and brevis brachius externus, and the acromius, placed on the hinder part of the arms, by their contractile twitch, fetch back the forearm into a straight line with the cubit, with no less force than that with which it was bent out. The same thing obtains in all the limbs, and in every movable part of the body. A finger is not bent and straightened without the contraction of two muscles taking place. It is evident, therefore, that the animal functions require that particular disposition of the muscles which we describe by the name antagonist muscles. A. Thank you, Isabel. This does indeed make the subject very plain. These muscles contract at will. E. But how can the will operate in this manner? I've always wished to understand. I. And I regret that I cannot satisfy you on this point. If we trace the cause of muscular action by the nerves to the brain, we are no nearer a solution of the mystery, for we cannot know what power sets the organs of the brain at work, whether it be foreign to or of itself. We will come now, if you please, to sensibility, which belongs to the nerves. A. I have a very indefinite idea of the nerves. E. My ideal is sufficiently definite in its shape, but so droll. I do not think of them as being flesh of my flesh, but as species of the genus fairy. They are to us what the Nereides are to the green wave, the dryads to the oak, and the hamadryads to the little flower. They are quite omnipotent in their operations. They make us cry or they make us laugh, thrill us with rapture or woe as they please, and, my dear Isabel, I shall not allow you to cheat me out of this pleasing fancy. You may tell me just what they are, but I shall be as incredulous as possible. I. They are very slender white cords, extending from the brain and spinal marrow, 12 pairs from the former and 30 from the latter. These send out branches so numerous that we cannot touch the point of a pin to a spot that has not its nerve. The mucous membrane is F. Oh, these technicals! What is the mucous membrane? I. It is a texture or web of fibers, which lines all cavities exposed to the atmosphere, for instance, the mouth, windpipe, and stomach. It is the seat of the senses of taste and smell. E. And the nerves are the little witches that inform the brain how one thing is sweet, another bitter, one fragrant, another nauseous. Alimentiveness ever after frowns or smiles accordingly. So it seems that the actions of the brain and of the external senses are reciprocated by the nerves, or something of this sort. How is it, Isabel? Oh, I see. You say sensibility belongs to the nerves, so sights by means of what? I. Of the optical nerves. E. Yes, and sounds by means of the I. Auditory nerves. E. Yes, convey impressions of externals to the brain, and, upon this hint, the brain acts in its constant reflections, and in the nervous impulses which induce muscular contractibility, and this muscular contractibility is a contraction of the fibers of the muscles. This contraction, of course, shortens them, and this latter must result in the bending of the arm. I think I understand it. What are the brain and spine, Isabel? How are they connected? I. You will get correct ideas of the texture of the brain by observing that of animals. It occupies the whole cavity of the skull, is rounded and irregular in its form, full of prominences, alias bumps. These appear to fit themselves to the skull, but doubtless the bone is molded by the brain. The brain is divided into two parts. The upper and frontal part is called the cerebrum, and the other the cerebellum. The former is the larger division, and it is the seat of the moral sentiments and intellectual faculties. The latter is the seat of the propensities, domestic and selfish. A. I thank you, Isabel. Now, what is this spine, of which there is so much complaint nowadays? I will answer you from Paley. The spine, or backbone, is a chain of joints of very wonderful construction. It was to be firm yet flexible. Firm, to support the erect position of the body. Flexible, to allow of the bending of the trunk in all degrees of curvature. It was further, also, to become a pipe or conduit for the safe conveyance from the brain of the most important fluid of the animal frame, that, namely, upon which all voluntary motion depends, the spinal marrow, a substance not only of the first necessity to action, if not to life, but of a nature so delicate and tender, so susceptible and impatient of injury, that any unusual pressure upon it, or any considerable obstruction of its course, is followed by paralysis or death. Now, the spine was not only to furnish the main trunk for the passage of the medullary substance from the brain, but to give out, in the course of its progress, small pipes therefrom, which, being afterwards indefinitely subdivided, might, under the name of nerves, distribute this exquisite supply to every part of the body. Alice. I understand now why disease of the spine causes such involuntary contortions and gestures in some instances. Its connection with the brain and nerves is so immediate that it cannot suffer disease without affecting the whole nervous system. I. It cannot. The spinal cord, or marrow, is a continuation of the brain. But we must not devote any more time to this subject. Bertha. I want to ask you something about the different parts of the eye, Isabel. When lectured on optics, I lost nearly all the benefit of his lecture, except a newly awakened desire for knowledge on this subject. He talked of the retina, cornea, iris, etc. Please tell me more precisely what they are. I. The retina is a nervous membrane, in other words, a thin network formed of very minute, sensitive filaments. It is supposed by some to be an expansion of the optic nerve, and on this the images of objects we see are formed. It is situated at the back part of the eye. Rays pass through the round opening in the iris, which we call the pupil. B. What did the lecturer say is the cause of the color of the pupil? I. He said that its want of color is to be imputed to the fact that rays of light which enter there are not returned. They fall on the retina, forming there images of objects. And you recollect he said that absence of rays is blackness. The iris is a kind of curtain, covering the aqueous humor. Aqueous is from the Latin aqua, water. It is confined only at its outer edge, or circumference, and is supplied with muscular fibers, which confer the power of adjustment to every degree of light. It contracts or dilates involuntarily, as the light is more or less intense, as you must have observed. The rays of light falling on that part of the iris which immediately surrounds the pupil cause it to be either black, blue, or hazel. We will discuss the other four senses as briefly as possible. The sense of taste, says Hayward, resides in the mucous membranes of the tongue, the lips, the cheeks, and the fauces. Branches of nerves extend to every part of the mouth where the sense of taste resides. The fluid with which the mouth is constantly moistened is called mucus, and chiefly subserves to the sense of taste. Anne. I have observed that when the mucus is dried by fever, food is nearly tasteless. I now understand the reason. E. Apropos to the senses, let me ask if feeling and touch are the same. Alfred says they are. I contend they are not, precisely. I. Hayward thinks a distinction between them unnecessary. He says they are both seated in the same organs, and have the same nerves, but the sense of feeling is more general, extending over the whole surface of the skin and mucous membrane, while that of touch is limited to particular parts, being in man most perfect in the hand, and the sense of feeling is passive, while that of touch is active. This sense is in the skin, and is most perfect where the epidermis or external coat is the thinnest. We will look through this little magnifying glass at the skin on my hand. You see the very minute prominences all over the surface. These points are called papillae. They are supposed to be the termination of the nerves, and the locale of sensation. E. Will you shape my ideas of sensation? I. According to Lord Brougham, one of the English editors of this edition of Paley, it is the effect produced upon the mind by the operation of the senses, and involves nothing like an exertion of the mind itself. Of the sense of hearing I can tell you but little. Physiologists have doubts relative to many parts of the ear, and I do not understand the subject well enough to give you much information. I will merely name some of the parts and their relative situations. We have first the external ear, which, projecting as it does from the head, is perfectly adapted to the office of gathering sounds and transmitting them to the membrane called the tympanum, commonly called the drum of the ear, from its resembling somewhat, in its use and structure, the head of a drum. The tympanum is a cavity, of a cylindrical or tunnel form, and its office is supposed to be the transmission to the internal ear of the vibrations made on the membrane. These vibrations are first communicated to the malleus, or hammer. This is the first of 4 bones, united in a kind of chain, extending and conveying vibrations from the tympanum to the labyrinth of the ear beyond. The other bones are the incus, or anvil, the round bone, and the stapes, or stirrup, the latter so called from its resemblance to a stirrup iron. It is placed over an oval aperture, which leads to the labyrinth, and which is closed by means of a membranous curtain. The bones are provided with very small muscles, and move with the vibrations of the tympanum. The equilibrium of the air in the tympanum and the atmosphere is maintained by means of the Eustachian tube, which extends from the back part of the fauces, or throat, to the cavity of the tympanum. The parts last mentioned constitute the middle ear. Of the internal ear little is known. It has its semicircular canals, vestibules, and cochlea, but their agencies are not ascertained. The organ of smell is more simple. This sense lies, or is supposed to lie, in the mucous membrane which lines the nostrils and in the openings in connection. Particles are constantly escaping from odorous bodies, and, by being inhaled in respiration, they are thrown in contact with the mucous membrane. A. Before leaving the head, will you tell us something of the organs of voice? I. By placing your finger on the top of your windpipe, you will perceive a slight prominence. In males this is very large. It is the thorax. It is formed of 4 cartilages, 2 of which are connected with a third by means of 4 cords called vocal cords, from their performing an important part in producing the voice. Experiments have been made, which prove that a greater part of the larynx, except for the cords, may be removed without destroying the voice. Magendie thus accounts for the production of the voice. He says, "The air, in passing from the lungs in expiration, is forced out of small cavities, as the air cells and minute branches of the windpipe, into a large canal. It is thence sent through a narrow passage, on each side of which is a vibratory cord, and it is by the action of the air on these cords that the sonorous undulations are produced which are called voice." E. Do not the lips and tongue contribute essentially to speech? I. They do not. Hayward says he can bear witness to the fact that the articulation remains unimpaired after the tongue has been removed. The labials F and V cannot be perfectly articulated without the action of the lips. What subject shall we take next? A. A natural transition would be from the head to the heart, and, in connection, the circulation of the blood. I. Yes, I will give you an abstract of the ideas I gained in the study of Hayward's Physiology, and the reading of Dr. Paley's Theology. The heart, arteries, and veins are the agents of circulation. The heart is irregular and conical in its shape, and it is hollow and double. A. There is no channel of communication between these parts, is there? I. None, but each side has its separate office to perform. By the right, circulation is carried on in the lungs, and by the left, through the rest of the body. I will mark a few passages in Paley for you to read to us, Anne. They will do better than any descriptions of mine. A. Thank you, Isabel, for giving me an opportunity to lend you temporary relief. The disposition of the blood vessels, as far as regards the supply of the body, is like that of the water pipes in a city, viz., large and main trunks branching off by smaller pipes, and these again by still narrower tubes, in every direction and towards every point in which the fluid which they convey can be wanted. So far, the water pipes which serve a town may represent the vessels which carry the blood from the heart. But there is another thing necessary to the blood, which is not wanted for the water, and that is, the carrying of it back again to its source. For this office a reversed system of vessels is prepared, which, uniting at their extremities with the extremities of the first system, collects the divided and subdivided streamlets, first by capillary ramifications into larger branches, secondly by these branches into trunks, and thus returns the blood, almost exactly inverting the order in which it went out, to the fountain whence its motion proceeded. The body, therefore, contains two systems of blood vessels, arteries and veins. The next thing to be considered is the engine which works this machinery, viz., the heart. There is provided in the central part of the body a hollow muscle invested with spiral fibers, running in both directions, the layering intersecting one another. By the contraction of these fibers, the sides of the muscular cavity are necessarily squeezed together, so as to force out from them any fluid which they may at that time contain. The relaxation of the same fibers, the cavities are in their turn dilated, and, of course, prepared to admit every fluid which may be poured into them. Into these cavities are inserted the great trunks both of the arteries which carry the blood out, and of the veins which bring it back. As soon as the blood is received by the heart from the veins of the body, and before it is sent out again to its arteries, it is carried, by the force of the contraction of the heart, and by means of a separate and supplementary artery, to the lungs, and made to enter the vessels of the lungs, from which, after it has undergone the action, whatever it may be, of that viscus, it is brought back by a large vein once more to the heart, in order, when thus concocted and prepared, to be thence distributed anew into the system. This assigns to the heart a double office. The pulmonary circulation is a system within a system, and one action of the heart is the origin of both. For this complicated function 4 cavities become necessary, and 4 are accordingly provided. 2 called ventricles which send out the blood, viz., one into the lungs, in the first instance, the other into the mass, after it has returned from the lungs. 2 others also, called auricles, which receive the blood from the veins, viz., one as it comes from the body, the other as the same blood comes a second time after its circulation through the lungs. I. That must answer our purpose, dear Anne. Of the change which takes place in the blood, and of the renewal of our physical system, which is effected by circulation, I shall say nothing. We will pass to respiration. E. Whose popular name is breathing? I. Yes. The act of inhaling air is called inspiration, that of sending it out, expiration. Its organs are the lungs and windpipe. The apparatus employed in the mechanism of breathing is very complex. The windpipe extends from the mouth to the lungs. A. How is it that air enters it so freely, while food and drink are excluded? I. By a most ingenious contrivance. The opening to the pipe is called glottis. This is closed, when necessary, by a little valve or lid called the epiglottis. Epi means upon. E. And this faithful sentinel is none other than the perpendicular little body which we can see in our throats, and which we have dubbed palate. I. You are right, Eleonora. Over this, food and drink pass on their way to the road to the stomach, the gullet. The pressure of solids or liquids tends to depress this lid on the glottis, and its muscular action in deglutition, or swallowing, tends to the same effect. As soon as the pressure is removed, the lid springs to its erect position, and the air passes freely. Larynx and trachea are other names for the windpipe, and pharynx is another for the gullet. The larynx divides into two branches at the lungs, and goes to each side. Hence, by subdivisions, it passes off in numerous smaller branches to different parts of the lungs, and terminates in air cells. The lungs, known in animals by the name of lights, consist of 3 parts, or lobes, 1 on the right side and 2 on the left. Alice. The lights of inferior animals are very light and porous. Do our lungs resemble them in this? I. Yes, they are full of air tubes and air cells. These, with the blood vessels and the membrane which connects, and this is cellular, that is, composed of cells, forms the lungs. The process of respiration involves chemical, mechanical, and vital, or physiological principles. Of the mechanism I shall say but little more. You already know that the lungs occupy the chest. Of this the breastbone forms the front, the spine, the back wall. Attached to this bone are 12 ribs on each side. These are joined by muscles, which are supposed to assist in elevating them in breathing, thus enlarging the cavity of the chest. The lower partition is formed by a muscle of great power, called the diaphragm, and by the actions of this organ alone common inspiration can be performed. Hayward says, the contraction of this muscle necessarily depresses its center, which was before elevated towards the lungs. The instant this takes place, the air rushes into the lungs through the windpipe, and thus prevents a vacuum, which would otherwise be produced between the chest and lungs. Expiration is the reverse of this. The chemistry of respiration regards the change produced in the blood by respiration. To this change I have before alluded. Anne. When we consider the offices of the heart and lungs, their importance in vital economy, how dangerous appears the custom of pressing them so closely between the ribs by tight lacing. I. Yes, fearful and fatal beyond calculation. And one great advantage in a general knowledge of our physical system is the tendency this knowledge must have to correct this habit. A. To me there is not the weakest motive for tight lacing. Everything but pride must revolt at the habit, and there is something positively disgusting and shocking in the wasp-like form, labored breathing, purple lips and hands of the tight lacer. E. They indicate such a pitiful servitude to fashion, such an utter disregard of comfort, when it comes in collision with false notions of elegance. Well for our sex, as we could not be induced to act from a worthier motive, popular opinion is setting in strongly against this practice. Many of our authors and public lecturers are bringing strong arms and benevolent hearts to the work. A. Yes, but to be perfectly consistent, should not the fashions of the Lady's Book and the Lady's Companion and of Graham's Magazine be more in keeping with the general sentiment? Their contributors furnish essays depreciating the evils of tight lacing, and tales illustrative of its evil effects, yet the figures of their plates of fashion are uniformly most unnaturally slender, and these are offered for national standards. E. And, more's the pity, followed as such. I. I think the improvements you mention would only cause a temporary suspension of the evil. They might indeed make it the fashion to wear natural waists, but like all other fashions it must unavoidably give way to new modes. They might top off a few of the branches, but science, a knowledge of physiology alone, is capable of laying the axe at the root of the tree. What is digestion, Eleonora? E. It is the dissolving, pulverizing, or some other ing of our food, isn't it? I. Hayward says that it is an important part of that process by which aliment taken into the body is made to nourish it. He divides the digestive apparatus into the mouth and its appendages, the stomach and the intestines. The teeth, tongue, jaws, and saliva perform their respective offices in mastication. Then the food passes over the epiglottis, you recollect, down the gullet to the stomach. The saliva is an important agent in digestion. It is secreted in glands which pour it into the mouth by a tube about the size of a wheat straw. Alice. I heard our physician say that food should be so thoroughly masticated before deglutition, you see I have caught your technicals, Isabel, that every particle would be moistened with the saliva. Then digestion would be easy and perfect. He says that dyspepsia is often incurred and perpetuated by eating too rapidly. I. Doubtless this is the case. As soon as the food reaches the stomach, the work of digestion commences, and the food is converted into a mass, neither fluid nor solid, called chyme. With regard to this process there have been many speculative theories. It has been imputed to animal heat, to putrefaction, to a mechanical operation, something like that carried on in the gizzard of a fowl, to fermentation and maceration. It is now a generally adopted theory that the food is dissolved by the gastric juices. Anne. If these juices are such powerful solvents, why do they not act on the stomach when they are no longer supplied with subjects in the shape of food? I. According to many authorities they do. Comstock says that hunger is produced by the action of the gastric juices on the stomach. This theory does not prevail, however, for it has been proved by experiment that these juices do not act on anything that has life. Alice. How long does it take food to digest? I. Food of a proper kind will digest in a healthy stomach in 4 or 5 hours. It then passes to the intestines. Anne. But why does it never leave the stomach until thoroughly digested? I. At the orifice of the stomach there is a sort of valve, called pylorus, or doorkeeper. Some have supposed that this valve has the power of ascertaining when the food is sufficiently digested, and so allows chyme to pass, while it contracts at the touch of undigested substances. A. How wonderful! I. And how passing wonder he who made us such! Alice. No wonder that the poet said, Strange that a harp of 1,000 strings should keep in tune so long. Anne. No wonder that the Christian bends in lowly adoration and love before such a Creator and such a Preserver. E. Now, dear Isabel, will you tell us something more? I. Indeed, Eleonora, I have already gone much farther than I intended when I commenced, but I knew not where to stop. Even now, you have just commenced the study of yourselves. Let me urge you to read in your leisure hours, and reflect in your working ones, until you understand physiology, as well as you now do geography. D. End of section 22, and end of Mind Amongst the Spindles, edited by Charles Knight. Read by MaryAnn Spiegel, in Elmhurst, Illinois, September 2012.